explored areas both in Kosovo and in Switzerland. So some of you may be a little bit puzzled. Why comparing explored areas in Kosovo and Switzerland? So well, it's a group of friends. Here's the name of the four of us. So two from Switzerland, one from nowhere, and Rosanna Rasha from Kosovo. We met many years ago with the idea of exploring the territory and this very fascinating phenomenon that we call urban sprawl. So, at the beginning it seems a little bit strange, Kosovo and Switzerland. Kosovo is probably the poorest country in Europe, and Switzerland is for sure the most richest country in Europe. So, but then you come here and you look at the images and it's, I mean, it's not very easy to know. I mean, yes, this looks like Kosovo, no? But if you compare it, I mean, urban pattern is very similar. And traveling in both countries, it made us many questions, right? We just came from listening to a wonderful lecture by Michael Jacob, talking about the Swiss sublime. But actually, not everything in Switzerland is so sublime. Sprawl. And sprawl is this name that we give to this parts of the city that are a little bit like oil ash, like spills of oil that just fall in the landscape. The position of the countries. The comparative table, so we see that actually both are quite small countries. Switzerland is only almost roughly 8 million. Kosovo is roughly more than 2 million. But actually there's a very strong link between it. And as many of you know, and probably many of you have family, friends that live in Switzerland or lived in Switzerland. So actually the more you study these two countries, the more they have in common. So, in this very naive manner, we went and studied what we thought was a glossary, a vocabulary of urban settings. So we were looking at the density of these sprawl areas, and we found that actually the density is quite similar. So most people in Switzerland and Kosovo live in this in-between. That's not a city, but it's not really the village. It's this thing that pretends to be a village, but it's not really a village. And most of these people living here, working offices, international firms, both in Switzerland or Kosovo. Then public space. Again, Michael Jacob was talking about the Swiss landscape, but then there are many Swiss landscape architects that are not that good. For example, look at this urban park here. It's really, I mean, it's very designed, and everything is designed, the lamps, the wall, the benches, but actually it looks quite ugly and quite unuseful. Actually, some parks in Kosovo are much simpler, much uglier, but much more friendly. So sometimes, by walking and comparing these two countries, sometimes you notice that spending too much money is not always the solution. Sometimes the simple, stupid idea of bench, tree, and grass is just enough, more than enough. Again, the streets. And it's nice to see some greenery in the streets. So I'm showing these images with the idea of breaking a little bit the Swiss sublime. Switzerland, again, year after year, normally it's the country that's most represented in the Venice Biennale. But as you see, there's plenty of B-side to it. architecture that's not nice at all. Streets with no vegetation, streets with no trees, just concrete, asphalt, train lines, and missing a little bit of humanity. So, sprawl. I guess most of you here are young architects, and many of you probably are willing to build in the future nice museums, libraries, public buildings. But actually, the first job most of you are going to have is probably the house of a friend, or an uncle, or family. So actually looking at the sprawl is important, because it's there where you can actually do something. I'm not sure how it is here, but I mean, I was trained in the schools of Geneva and Barcelona, and I was trained to learn that sprawl was really, really bad. I mean, sprawl was evil. And now that I live in the US, I'm starting to see the other side of sprawl. And after speaking with many people that have been looking at sprawl for the last years, sprawl can be bad, but at the same time there's lots of margin to improve. And again, I mean, if as architects we want to be in the table conversation to face the challenges of the future, I mean, it's important that we look at sprawl in a very serious way. Because sprawl, yes, I mean, sprawl has a problem of traffic, it creates traffic, it's very difficult to bring services to sprawl. But traffic, I mean, if in the future people work less, because in the future people are going to live less, work from home, the cars are going to be self-driving and electrical. I mean, maybe there's many things to think about the future of sprawl. And it's the data. I mean, there's an Austrian biologist that just mentioned, has researched that because of fertilizers and all this shit we throw to the fields to grow our crops, nature, animals are retreating to the city. The city has become a much nicer place for animals than the fields that are full of fertilizers. So actually these sprawl areas are much more friendly to nature than nature itself. And then all the philosophers that have thought about living, they all I mean, Bachelard said, you cannot dream of living in an apartment. I mean, everyone dreams to live in a house with a basement. So, I mean, I'm not going to defend sprawl, but I think it's interesting enough to look at it. Coming back to landscape architects, we met Sebastian Malon, the philosopher of landscape architecture, who against the ideology of Rem-Koolhaas, where the program has to establish the project of architecture, he as a counter proposition, he proposes that the suburbanism, actually the suburban, that's the layer that's under the urban, informs the project. So in a way, suburbanism is more friendly to the existing landscape than the big project of the city that comes upon it. And then we should not forget that in Europe, the landscape is very old, it's very deep. So the cities exist, but the countryside is also very old in Europe. And in Kosovo as well, it's as part of Europe. The rivers, the water management, all this makes that the territory in Europe is very easy to inhabit compared to the so-called virgin areas of the United States, for example. So, without any further ado, I'll go straight to the film, which is a work in progress yet. There's many people that have been left outside to adapt the film to this short intervention. But I hope you enjoy it. And after the film, we'll be having a discussion on these topics that come in the field around sport.
what does it mean, these suburban landscapes? Because what is then not suburban? We have, in a certain way, two elements or two types of settlements that are a starting point. So one is the city and the other is the village. And classically the city is walled. That's the major definition of a city. It has a wall around the city. And the city is a place of centrality. And is also, of course, a place of power. Whereas the village is a kind of settlement, and the village can be bounded or not. It can be walled or not. It can be dense or it can be extended or dispersed even. But the village is a kind of unity of everyday life. Now, when does that change, that situation? And it's important to understand that that changed with the industrialization process. So it changed somehow or somewhere between the late 18th century, especially in Switzerland, where industrialization started very early, and let's say the mid-19th century. And the term urbanization was a new term labeled by Ildefonso Cerdá as a kind of term to show a situation in which, let's say, the walled city was not the model anymore, but urban extension started to dominate territories. So, in fact, already the term urbanization means the end of the city and the end of the village. Urbanization is only possible with industrialization, because industrialization means that there is a much higher concentration of means of production and of labor power and of people on the one hand, and on the other, urbanization means also the extension. So it means the construction of new means of communication, of new means of transportation, of roads, of streets, of railways, that allow, in a certain way, the extension of this urban fabric.
Mies van der Rohe in 1955 says that's why we can't build cities anymore. Old cities, planned cities, and there's a sort of pause, and he says it goes on like a forest, and we shall have to learn to live in the jungle and even do well by that. And I think that statement, mid-50s, is as true now as when it was said. You know, I think that urbanization and the ending of that word, you know, speaks of process, goes on like a jungle, unending, and so we have these urbanized regions. We don't really, strictly speaking, have cities anymore.
In later times, then, of course, there were all sorts of trials to reconstruct that. So to reconstruct the city, still again is the model of the walled city. So the city as something that is bounded, and the village as something that is not physically bounded, but that is socially bounded. And these were always hopeless trials, because the process of urbanization means that you have these dialectics of concentration and of extension. So today we speak about planetary urbanization, because the planet is now the horizon of that urbanization process. And in a certain way, if you put it, let's say, as an extreme formulation, you could say every part of this planet today is in one way or another affected by urbanization processes.
You hear this kind of constant evocation of the rural-urban dichotomy. You know, Rem Koolhaas has made the countryside a popular term again, or, you know, people like me when I talk about the hinterland or the productive landscape. But the city is always positioned relative to something that is a non-city, that somehow it is outside of the city. And I think the urban is all pervasive, because, you know, no part of the earth is not beholden to any kind of urban process, whether it's cultivation, drilling, excavation, contamination, pollution, surveillance. You know, I think we have urbanized every single aspect of the planet. So even just to talk about a rural-urban migration as if there is a rural now relative to urban, while the people are moving from one aspect of urbanization to another. And then I think it behooves us to understand what intensities of urbanization exist, even in places that seem completely devoid of urban centers as we know it.
Now, if you look from that perspective, many questions that were treated for decades and decades and debates that were very important looks outdated already. So, for instance, the question of the urban and the suburban and the rural. The dream, especially in Europe, the dream, but also in North America, the dream for many of the people is still the village, okay? So the dream is not the city, the dream is the village. And then they say, okay, the village is the rural, which is sometimes true, sometimes not. But it is still this dream, you have a small village, you have your own house in the village, and you have your own land. And, okay. And then there is this other dream of the urban as a place of, especially of course in the Latin tradition, in Italy, in France. So the city as, let's say, the main place of civilization, where we have all the wealth of a society is concentrated in the city and is brought together there, and also, let's say, the basic moments of social innovation are kind of taking place in those urban spaces. So out of that you have the famous call that already Henri Lefebvre brought up, so the right to the city, le droit à la ville, so something that, so everybody should have access to the, let's say, the possibilities, the options, the potentials that the urban offers. Okay, so we see now we have two dreams. We have the dream of the village and we have the dream of the urban as a place of encounter, as a place of innovation, as a place of access to the basic, to the most important resources of the society. So these two elements. Now, out of those two dreams, if we combine those two dreams, then we have sprawl. Okay?
Sprawl is, it's actually almost a universal term for the suburban. And you can take suburban really literally, like subclass, right? It's a subclass urbanism, which is kind of, at least from a rhetorical standpoint, pretty striking. It tells you a lot about how we imagine our environment today. And sprawl is an extension of that. It's out of control, it's unordered, it's a machine that's running on economic priorities that have nothing to do with a specific place, or setting up a rational, logical order where, in our traditional definitions of urbanism, parts can come together to make a whole that's greater than their sum, right? Most of our definitions of urbanism are holistic, that we can't even start using the word city until the whole exceeds the sum of building by building by building by building. And the crisis, I think, that we've seen in the last 50 years is that it's not adding up, right? All we're getting, a field of buildings, arbitrary buildings is not a city, right? Everyone agrees on that. There's a difference between a city and an arbitrary field of buildings. And I think if you unpack the word sprawl, you get some of these sentiments in it, and a lot of them are legit.
A sprawl which has taken place in Europe in the past 2 decades, and it has developed also very quickly in the new countries liberated from the Soviet bloc since the 90s, so it's a widespread pattern, has many reasons. One of them is, of course, a sort of loose aspiration at emulating the American way of life. Another one is the lousy quality of collective housing in many cities, and the idea that a more decentralized pattern of urbanity will be more comfortable on an everyday basis. In France, it was, in many cases, in Germany also, imitated in a very superficial manner by the interaction of manufacturers, private developers, sometimes coming from the US, incentives given to people to build single-family houses, which stole away the money which could have been used to improve the existing collective housing schemes. So there has been a sort of zero-sum game in which new spawning suburbs have deepened the crisis of the interurban or suburban housing estates, which have been very problematic, in particular in the case of France. And now we're at a moment in which the territory differences between the purely rural territory and suburban territory are disappearing, in which the very legitimate political decentralization has given much power everywhere in Europe to the local mayors, who will never refuse a building permit by a potential voter. So the system is also, which could be developed in a better way, is corrupted in many ways by the democratic structure of New York.
You could say that suburbanization is not really an accident. It is partly produced by the automobile, it's partly produced by supportive banking, mortgage operations, and also building bylaws related to the mortgage operations in relation to the... these forces come together and produce a result. It seems spontaneous, but yes, I don't think it is. It's not exactly spontaneous.
Since I consider myself, or I am, a wordsmith, I stumble over words, and I do not like words like sprawl. I do not like words like sustainability. They're ideological words. I find them very disruptive, because that means that when you use the word sprawl, you automatically give it a certain negativity. It's embedded in the word, and it cannot be washed out. Therefore, I try to avoid that word, and I prefer to think about distance. Distance is for me a much more objective word, and distance is something that's embedded in our various cultures in so many ways. In American culture, there is what I call American distance, which is a bizarre combination of wanting to overcome distance at the same time as making distance. And that particular complexity produces the distributed city in America. Once we have kind of invented ourselves as individuals out of a collective that I guess once was extremely strong and powerful, because you had to have a collective to survive. You stand alone with your end, you expand it by having your family, and you want a distance to your neighbors. And because you want to be able to point at the house and say, that is my house. You think about standing in Hong Kong in a high-rise building and you say, that's my apartment, and there is no way that you can even, by the wildest imagination, find exactly where it is, because it's actually very hard to count in vertical fashion. So that distance brings us to the in-between. The in-between is the most powerful kind of unknown we have. And that unknown needs to be explored to a much greater philosophical depth than it ever has been. The in-between exists in Chinese culture, it can exist in Swedish culture. I'm sure it exists in Kosovo, it certainly exists in Switzerland.
Of course, in Japan you have this tradition of intervening space, and you have this tradition that you have no sound information. So you live much closer together already by listening. There's a completely different relation between the people. It's much more individualized and visualized.
At the end, nobody's happy, because you don't have the village anymore, because the village is fully urbanized, and you don't have the city anymore, because the city becomes a kind of, almost a kind of amorphous space where a lot of things are coming together, but at the same time, these urban spaces are also kind of fading out or blurring, and you're missing these kind of clear structures of the city you're missing this high density of the city that you like.
It's like the Gertrude Stein quote, there is no more there, you know. Or Francois Scheuer once said, you know, if it wasn't for the graphic science, we couldn't negotiate these urbanized regions because no one could find anything anymore. And unlike, you know, more compact cities, where, you know, the street pattern and the landmarks not only give a sense of identity, but also make one can use the city without graphic science.
And the worst is then, of course, these kind of amorphous places in between. So where the village definitely ends and where the urban kind of disappears. And this is then what we call in Switzerland the agglo, okay? The agglo, so the agglomeration, which is something that you don't know what it is this and that, and there might be a farmhouse, and there might be a motorway, and there might be a shopping mall, and there might be even a luxury restaurant or something, and there is maybe even some industrial zones still, and all that together in a kind of mess. And so we have everything, but at the same time you have nothing, because you don't feel the quality anymore, and you don't know where you are.
The phenomenon we see in Kosovo is the same phenomenon we see all over the world, that the world goes down, that the agglomerations are booming, and that the rural areas are losing. There's a general trend we also see in Kosovo. If you look to Pristina is growing. It's the most economic part of Kosovo, so the people have to go there to earn money because they have the jobs. If they are not able to commute every day, they settle down in Pristina. And Kosovo is not as big as other countries, so it's in most cases possible to travel each day to Pristina and leave in the agglomeration, because you can say Kosovo has 2 million inhabitants. You can say we see Kosovo as agglomeration area around Pristina. But what we are facing in Kosovo is from different aspects, a little bit different as what we can see, I think, in Switzerland or Austria or in other countries. And it's related to the history of this state. You're not allowed to forget it was part of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is a socialistic, communistic state, had a very clear, structured, organized, central planning system. This was the first phase. Okay, then there was the period before the war, where Kosovo lost under Milosevic this autonomous status, and then there was the war with all negative results, and then there started the rebuilding after the war. And in this phase, nobody asked for controlled urban development. It was important to give shelter for the people. Yeah?
Well, first we have to see that there was also in socialist time, in Yugoslav time, there was a lack of housing existing already, and then there was a long period of oppression by the Soviet government in Kosovo, which was clearly then for the majority of the people, the Kosovo Albanians, not to invest into housing or anything. There were a lot of, as we know, a lot of them went out Kosovo and were going to European countries, and they were saving money. So in the moment the NATO troops went in 1999, the Kosovo Albanians took this as liberation, and they started immediately building houses for their families. So they invested a lot of money, they saved in Switzerland, in Germany, wherever, on bank accounts, into housing for their families. That's one thing. thing. The other thing is that in post-conflict situations, that's typical, like in Pristina, as in others, Kabul or wherever, you have always the problem that there's a huge amount of migrants coming back to their hometown and a lot of rural migrants moving in. They double or triple their amount of people living there. So the lack of housing is enormous there. Even if there were no damages by war, whatever, like in Pristina, they had no problems with that. But as we tried to figure it out, we were calculating that they at least doubled their population in Pristina in a very few years, in 2-3 years. And then this huge lack of housing was a huge market also. So for the people, it was not only to build houses for themselves and their family members, it was also an occasion to make money, and more or less the only thing you could do in that situation.
The diaspora, the Albanian diaspora, so people that live abroad in European countries and have families in Kosovo during the 90s, they came back with the money. And the first thing that people did, they built. And then this is where architecture and sprawl and planning and urbanism met together in a pot. And it was really becoming complex. It was really becoming difficult to put everything in order because it was all. Having a house, having a home, after 99, I'd say in 2000, 2002, for people living in Kosovo was very important. It was absolutely very important. But then the next thing that was also important was to go back to the job. Or do you start a job? You need to start an office. So what is the best place? The best place is your house. The house became a multifunctional place. A house became a place to live, a place for job creation, for the family, for the person living in the house, but also for, let's say, the larger family.
Okay, that's all.